Right, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to this, the 17th meeting in 2013 of the Economy, Energy and Tourism Committee. Can I remind everyone present, please, to either turn off or at least turn to silent all mobile phones and other electronic devices. We have no apologies this morning, so we will proceed straight on with the agenda. Item 1, are members content that we take item 3 on the agenda in private?
Agreed.
Great, thank you. Okay, item 2 in the agenda is the commencement of our scrutiny of the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill. I'd like to welcome this morning Professor Russell Griggs and Gary Clark, who are both members of the Regulatory Review Group, set up by the Scottish Government in 2004. Now, we have a written statement from you, Professor Griggs, so I don't think you want to add anything to that at this stage. I think we can just go straight into questions, and I can remind members, if they would please keep their questions short and to the point, and if we could have responses which are as short and to the point as possible, that will help us get through the quite broad range of issues I think we want to try and cover in the time available. Can I maybe just start off by asking, in relation to the this question of inconsistent application of regulations across Scotland, which really goes to the heart of what this bill is trying to do. Can you give us some examples of difficulties which have been experienced arising from this inconsistent application in different parts of Scotland?
Yes, I think I would start off by perhaps our most recent report, which is we've just published on our website a review of the Knife Dealers Act. And I think if you look across Scotland, where government has put in place legislation where they give a power to the council rather than a duty to the council to enact things, then it's left to the council to figure out how to do things, which means in the particular case of the knife crimes bill, the Knife Act, that some councils will license some entities that other councils won't. And it's particularly relevant up in rural areas where, because knives tend to be a more particular part of, let's say, retailers up there who are selling to people who are going out in the hills to do all sorts of things, that you get a different view of it. We also experienced that back 3 or 4 years ago in the terms of alcohol licensing, where if you're Tesco's, for example, the form you have to fill in to apply for your licence can be completely different in Aberdeen than it is in Dumfries and Galloway. So, and I guess where we've got to in this is not about the democratic process and the thing that local council should do, which is make decisions. The consistency is about is why do you need a different process across Scotland to fill in all the forms that you have to do? Would it not be much different? And I guess, and I apologise, Convener, I'm already going into a long answer, but let me just try and be brief on this. About 3 years ago, COSLA have a thing called the Regulatory Forum, which we sit on, and it put into place a number of little theme groups, and one of them was on consistency. And I chaired that group. And the unanimous view from the practitioners out in the councils, so that's people who do licensing, who do planning, who do trading standards, who do environmental health, is a move towards more consistent processes would benefit them. And the reason it would benefit them is it means they can exchange information much more easier, you can look at best practice, they can talk to clients about what they've done, anything else. And this inconsistency, therefore, is not just a disbenefit to business, but is a disbenefit to the practitioners who have to deliver this and the councils themselves. So we've seen a myriad of different examples in planning and licensing and in the fees that are charged across Scotland. And we've had representation over the years from street traders and from the Showman's Guild around the variances and licenses. And we understand why the variances are there, but there is a general inconsistency on how government bills are put into place. And therefore all this legislation is trying to do is, where we all agree it's a sensible thing to do, and I think that's what we have to preface this, is that to have a national standard of how you do the process across Scotland would seem to just be an eminently sensible thing to do. I don't know if you want to comment on that, Gary.
Yeah, I think Russell has summed it up there. Certainly areas that we have experienced in terms of people coming before us in the RRG and explaining where they are operating in different parts of Scotland and different processes apply, different fees apply. I mean, one example that was brought to my attention outside of the RRG was in South Ayrshire Council, it's cheaper to licence a zoo than it is to licence a kennel. And licensing a kennel in South Ayrshire.
Because there are lots of zoos in South Ayrshire, obviously.
Clearly. In South Ayrshire, it's also 25 times more expensive to license a kennel than it is in Glasgow. So there are pretty stark differences across the country in terms of application. And obviously the reasoning behind it all is in terms of it is supposed to represent the cost of the licensing process. But when you look at some of the stark differences that exist in different parts of the country, you do begin to question quite how that is being applied.
Okay. I mean, I think we want to go on and explore in more detail, and I know some other members have got questions on this issue of the conflict between this idea of having a national standards and local decision making. But given what you've said, Professor Griggs, I mean, your view is you're not impeding local decision making in any way by trying to set these national standards.
Indeed not. And as I said, I think that if you speak to the practitioners, the licensing clerks, for example, here, the opportunity to have one set of forms throughout Scotland, although we've managed to get it down to 13 forms you have to apply for an alcohol licence, and that's across all of Scotland. The ability to be able to look at somebody else's in the same form as yours as you're going through the process will help actually your own committee make a better democratic decision, because you can look at what was done elsewhere, you can see what happened to the committee. So this is all about process. This is not at all about trying to influence the committee's decision. It's just about saying, why don't we all just fill in the same forms across Scotland and try to put some consistency into some of the things that we do.
Yeah, interesting. Some members of the committee last week met informally with various stakeholders, and one of the other issues that came up was the question of taxi licensing, where there are in different local authorities very different standards for licensing of taxis and private hire cars, which caused a major issue for companies operating across a range of local authorities. So that might be something I think that might be caught by the bill.
It would, and we always recall the very first one we came across, which was the window cleaner's licence, which is if you want to be a window cleaner, you get a licence in one local authority, and then you have to go and get 32 other licences to do it across the rest of Scotland, which just strikes me as odd. As why, if we accepted a window cleaner could clean windows in South Lanarkshire, why couldn't they go and clean windows everywhere else? And it just seems that some sort of regularisation of the process would help us all and cut out an awful lot of wasted resource, perhaps, that we use in being inconsistent.
That's very interesting. I didn't even know a window cleaner had to have a licence. I'll need to check with my window cleaner next time he comes round whether he has one. rather concerned he may not have one.
But no, we can he doesn't need a licence to do your windows, but he does need a licence to go and clean public buildings.
Right, thank you. Right, I'll bring in Dennis Robertson.
Good morning, gentlemen. Staying with this element of consistency, because it's one of your 5 principles, isn't it? I mean, to be consistent. I find it slightly strange that we're looking to get consistency, yet you're still advocating local autonomy. Can you maybe just sort of tease that out a wee bit more for me? Because we're looking at a national standard, but yet you're looking for local autonomy at the same time.
I think there are differences. I think the process, I think there are 2 things in anything you do in business, never mind in the public sector. There's a process of getting it up to the point where you're going to make a decision. And then local conditions can come in to make a decision. If I can give an example of an alcohol licence in Paisley Road in Glasgow, where Tesco's applied for a licence at one end of the road and got it and didn't get it at the other end. And the influence of the democratic process is quite correct there, because what they did was, the judgment of the committee was, while the process was the same, the second Tesco added no extra value to the retail economy over that particular part. But that was something that would be totally different in another part of Scotland when they considered it. So I still think you have to give the local authorities the benefit to put local conditions into some of the decisions that they make. So I'm quite clear about the difference between process and local decision making. And in most cases, if you look at planning, for example, they can appeal if they wish to, but there are local circumstances that do vary across Scotland and how we do it. And if we go back to the one that Gary, that we both talked about, which is the Showman's Guild, the reason for some of the different licensing charges across Scotland are quite interesting, in that some councils will deem that to get a specific event ongoing, they need the person to turn up with their rides, etc. So charge them a very minimal fee to do that, because it's very much part of the tourism and other economic development they want to do for that area. In other parts of Scotland where that's not as important or it's not as critical, then the council may make a different decision on what they charge for that. And I don't have a lot of issues with that, given that you, on a local area, sorry, on a local basis, you'll always make the decision pertinent to that area. But that doesn't mean to say that the process that you have to do should be any different, if that answers your question.
Staying with the national standards, last week I was speaking with people from the environmental health officers, and one of the concerns they brought up was that there's perhaps the potential for a dilution of standards. The example given was that, cities like Glasgow, Edinburgh, Aberdeen have very high standards in certain areas, and who are looking at the licensing of street traders, for instance, sort of fast food, mobile sort of traders. Do you share their concerns that there could possibly be a dilution of standards?
No, I don't actually. I think if we use our practitioner bodies properly, like the environmental people, in helping us putting those standards together, and I think one of the good examples is in building standards, where we now have a national standard on certain parts of building standards across Scotland, which was put together by the practitioners themselves, and everybody now seems to agree it's a very good standard, and there's been no dilution in the expertise or what it gives. So no, I think it's like everything. If you do these things properly, there shouldn't be a dilution of standard. I don't know if Gary wants to comment on that.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose one example, really at a more international level, would be the current debate that Europe is having over health and safety standards in the oil and gas industry, where there was a very real prospect that basically Europe would go away, come up with its own standards and apply them to the North Sea, which is obviously Europe's sort of leading oil and gas production area. But instead, what Europe have done sensibly is look at the developments that have been made in health and safety in the UK or in the North Sea oil and gas area, which have been pieced together over recent years by the industry, by unions, etc. And they're now looking at applying some of those standards in the rest of Europe rather than having to come up with new standards of their own. So I think working with the industry in order to arrive at a set of standards which could have a more general application, I think would be welcome, and is certainly something we would advocate.
Yeah, and if I can, sorry, just comment back on that. And I suppose my retort would be to environmental standards people who we work with very closely, and we have a good relationship with them, is that national standards also would set the boundary, and therefore what each local authority would have to have in terms of resource to put those national standards into place, which is something we've had a concern on for some time, about whether there are enough environmental health officers, trading standards officers across Scotland to give you, because we believe quite strongly that those officers are there to help, but to enable businesses rather than to enforce businesses, and there's a real difference between that. So I think a good set of national standards also puts it down to each of the local authorities then, excuse me, or indeed nationally, about the type and level of resource we need to put those into place.
So are you content therefore, that the bill in itself will meet your principle of being consistent?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. In terms of the basis that we'll all make a decision that this is something that we feel should be done nationally before the bill comes into place. So we're not going to do it at the end, you do it at the beginning. So as long as we go through the process of all deciding that this is the way we want to do it, then yes, I'm fine.
And should you have a sixth principle, that is to be effective?
Well, that's an interesting question. I'll ponder on that for a minute, if I may. Yeah, it depends what effective legislation means, and I guess this comes back to our point about enabling and enforcing. You can be a policeman, so all you do with a company is go and tell them when they've got it wrong, or you can go and help them to not get it wrong in the first place. And I think, to me, effective legislation is only put in place then by the effective regulator, who goes and makes sure that he's an enabler, not an enforcer. He's an enforcer when he needs to be, but he's first an enabler, which works with businesses to understand the rationale for this and getting their mindset changed to do it. And if you go back to Gary's example of health and safety, I think one of the challenges we've had for the last 2 decades around health and safety is it's been based in a lot of businesses very much on making sure I comply rather than understanding what the benefits of health and safety can give to my company.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Stephen.
Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll bring in Chick Brodie, who probably wants to ask about opening a zoo in South Ayrshire.
Lucius didn't say South Ayrshire was a zoo. Good morning, gentlemen. I wonder if I may ask, your group's been in existence since 2004. It's now 2013, and we're looking at this bill. Can you give me examples, a major example where you've affected good regulation which has enjoyed substantial economic benefit for the government?
There are a number, so I'm trying to think about where the and I guess if you look at where SEPA are now and where SEPA were when we came into place in 2004, I think what RRG does is advise the government on ways to change things that it does to make them different. And initially, our main role was around making sure that the regulators were, as I explained a minute ago, enablers, not enforcers. And we've started to move forward from that. So that would be one, which is about how we're changing the regulators to become much more enablers. And that SEPA are part of this bill and indeed are giving evidence elsewhere in this building today about the way they're changing the organisation, I think is a good example of where we've had influence. We've also had influence, I think, on the way that government works and that parties work together, and this wonderful thing we now call multilateral consultation, which means getting everybody in a room to discuss subjects, has now become mandatory in certain parts of planning, like offshore wind and wave and large-scale projects, which is something that we recommended ages ago. I think the business regulatory impact assessment, which now says that for every bill that goes through Parliament that that affects business, that civil servants have to go and actually talk to the businesses that it will affect as a real impact. I think the changes that have come into place after our review of the alcohol licensing bill, so all of those have an economic impact. And the way you have economic impact is if we take our friends in SEPA, if you operate as an enabler, you're much more likely to find a good solution for the company than as a policeman, because if you're a policeman, that usually means they've done something wrong. So I think our influence has been on the way that people work. Yes, we have had specific influence. We've, into the Public Services Reform Bill now, we introduced a little, I think it's clause 17, which one of the challenges government has is that if a piece of legislation is seen to be silly, it takes you an awful long time if you need legislation change to find a hook to hang it back on. Section 17 now allows that if a bill or a rule offends one of the 5 principles of better regulation, a minister can change it through an SI. And I think that all those little bits added together means I think that Scotland now is seen in international terms as being ahead of the game in better regulation. And indeed, myself and Joe Brown, who is the lead civil servant on RRG, were asked about 4 weeks ago to go down and present to the RPC, the Regulatory Policy Committee in London, on how we deal with these type of issues in Scotland, because we're seen as being ahead of the game. And indeed, we're going across to Europe in July to present the same things. And it's because we've concentrated on better regulation, not more or less. So we concentrated on the process of making sure that what we deliver in Scotland works for both government and business.
Can I, just on that point, if I may interrupt,
Yeah, of course.
we're looking at this bill perhaps in a bit of isolation. I don't know, and we know what may or may not happen in September 2014. I just wonder how much attention is paid to competition law, either European or gold-plated by the current UK government, in terms of, we talked about regulations by SEPA, etc. How much, when you're reviewing this, how much attention do you pay to competition law?
Talk about competition.
It's certainly something we've discussed fairly regularly in terms of the RRG, and we certainly fed into the various committees that were looking into, or commissions that were looking into the gold plating of European legislation, both at Scottish and the UK level over the past few years. I think in terms of the situation going forward, I think clearly we would foresee perhaps a stronger role there in terms of potentially Scotland achieving some sort of constitutional change over the next few years that would allow it greater power and therefore greater responsibility.
Yes, it's interesting. I attended the David Hume Institute lecture 2 weeks ago about competition in a new Scotland. And clearly there are tangential points where regulation and regulatory reform will impact that. Now, it's significant in your 5 features. I'm not sure which one covers economic growth, which has to be, in my view, a substantive element of whatever we do. I'm very concerned about talking about national standards, which does not reflect, for example, the view of the respondents to the consultation, where nearly 70% of respondents were in favour of a more local setting of standards in exceptional circumstances. I don't know what these are, but I fail to understand how you measure, how you intend to measure, or how you have measured regulatory reform in terms of creating that substantial economic growth.
Let me try and answer. I mean, in our last annual report, which is now on our website, there's a big section on how we now believe that regulation is a key part of international competitiveness. And let me try and give you some examples on that. If you take the chemicals industry, for example, we've been chairing a forum in Grangemouth for the last 18 months now, which is to do with working with all the chemical companies there, the council, SEPA, Transport Scotland, everybody else, to look at how we ensure that group, that cluster of chemical companies in Grangemouth remains competitive in an international environment. And that, in a lot of cases, is down to regulation. So we've been discussing things like flooding and how the impact of flooding regulations will impact on Grangemouth. And at the beginning of the exercise, the companies were very worried that they were going to have to be involved heavily in what it is, because if the gentlemen who run INEOS in Grangemouth want to put up a proposal to their owners in China for £1 billion investment, the first thing that the investors want to know is that all of it's going to be spent on investing in the company and not on doing flood defences. So we've done that. We've also looked at things like the impact of the Industrial Emissions Directive, which brings together a whole series of current European directives into one, how that will impact on Grangemouth. And at the end of it now, we've got a much more competitive way of dealing with regulation areas within that cluster of chemical companies, which allows them now to be and have much more certainty about how they compete and how they can bid for money from because most of them are internationally owned. And that in many ways is how businesses see competition. If you look at carbon capture and storage, where we've been working with since the Longannet proposal back then, Scotland's the only place in the world now that has in place a regulatory framework that if you want to come and set up a carbon capture and storage plant in Scotland, will tell you exactly how long it's going to take, who's going to do it. There are 63 different regulations that you have to go through to set up a carbon capture and storage plant. But we know how to do it. We'll work in parallel with all the regulators. So we're internationally competitive, and indeed one of the institutes for carbon capture and storage came and held its conference in Scotland last week, exactly because we are seen as competitive. So it's about understanding that regulation is a real integral part of international competition, almost as important as money. And in a whole road of industries around Scotland, we've done that. But it doesn't mean making it easier. In one industry, for example, in meat processing, we know that we're more expensive than anywhere else in the UK to run a business, but that's okay, because that's driven by the farming community's desire to maintain the premium on Scottish meat, and came out of the foot and mouth crisis back in the early 2000s, where they said they never wanted that to happen again, and therefore to protect our farmers and the meat processing, the meat that comes out of there, we do have higher standards for our abattoirs and rendering plants in Scotland. But that again is to maintain our international competitiveness in that marketplace, where to do that we probably do need to have higher standards in Scotland.
Certainly didn't help us with Halls of Broxburn if that.
Probably didn't, no.
Thank you.
Just before I bring in Rhoda Grant, just follow up on I think Chick Brody's first question. You've made a lot of recommendations to government since 2004. How many of these recommendations have been rejected?
I have to say not many is the answer to your question, Convener. I can think of one or two that are still in process, if I can put it that way, but of all the things we've recommended government to do, they've in general done it. And indeed, if you look through the new planning legislation, which I'm sure will come before you at some point over the next year, and about our drive towards getting bilateral things out and multilateral things in, I think that's at the core of where Derek Mackay and his team now want to go, to make it understood that the best way to reach a proper decision is to get everybody involved in that decision around the one table at once, rather than do it one at a time. And it saves actually a huge amount of resource. The one we did, one we did about 5 years ago, took 3 years off the planning time. Now, not just in the resource for the company, but in the resource for the council and everybody else was on it. It was just, and if you can do that, then I think it shows economic impact.
Okay, thank you. Right, Rhoda Grant.
Can I just go back to kind of the local versus national? And just using one of the examples you mentioned yourself about the Showman's Guild, where some people might charge very little for a licence because they were trying to encourage them in as part of an event. On the other hand, if in a lucrative area where the Showman's Guild might be wanting to set up because they were going to make a lot of money, their licence might be higher. And then contrast that with kennels and the like. It could be that the same principle applies in South Ayrshire. They may think they're over-provided with kennels, therefore it is more expensive to get a kennel licence than that for a zoo. Who makes the decision as to what is local and what is prescribed as charging through the bill?
I think what I'd like to see is that I would like to leave in some areas the local councils to be able to make the ability on what the actual charge should be. Because as I said, if, for example, in the North East, for example, where the Showman's Guild, the licences are fairly low, but that's because a lot of the fairs and the events they go to are part of the intrinsic part of that community, and therefore the council want to keep them. What I would like to see, though, is more transparency about how the fees are put together. The one thing that you find very difficult to do across Scotland is to figure out how everybody worked it out. So, for example, if you're a showman, I think it's £25 you're charged to have a licence to do the Kirkcaldy Fair, which, as you know, goes on for a week. Whereas in Edinburgh, for that same one, you'd be charged £2,000. Now, I think that's up to the local council to decide what the amount of money could be. But I think the transparency of knowing how they got to that decision is something that's very unclear. And that's where we get most of the complaints about. It is, yes, to do with the difference in charging, but it's primarily to do with we don't know how they worked it out in the first place. And I think if there was more transparency nationally and we all agreed a way to show people how we did it, and Gary's quite correct, it's supposed to be at neutral cost. But one of the challenges is when you go back into local authority, how they work out their cost base is all different. But I think if we could have transparency, I have no issues with local councils deciding for economic reasons that they want to charge somebody one thing, another council charging something else. That's a council decision to make on economic grounds. But how they did it, I think, is something that we'd take away, and I'll ask Gary to comment. A lot of the complaints we get, it's just a lack of understanding about how local councils make those decisions.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think, you know, if you look at some of the bodies that have appeared before us, you know, it is a case they go to the local authority and they say, well, why is this, you know, 10 times, 20 times, 100 times more expensive in one local authority than another? When the process is supposed to be, you know, this is what it costs that local authority to process a licence application. I think in the circumstances you've described there, where a local authority is maybe actively seeking to incentivise, you know, a certain type of business to come to their area, then I think that is an understandable situation. I think if, you know, the Showman's Guild, for example, were aware that certain local authorities are keen to get the shows ongoing in their area and that there is a preferential rate, I think that's understandable. I think, well, you know, as has been said, the difficulty arises is that they're being told the same message by every local authority in Scotland, but the fee structure is so varied.
The bill as it stands allows Scottish ministers to prescribe the fees level. Who decides what can be made by a local decision, i.e. to encourage a fair inn, or who decides, for instance, if it's an alcohol licence or a dog licence or whatever, who decides what decisions remain local and are made for local reasons, and who decides what is then part of this better regulation that we have kind of a national symmetry to it?
My understanding is that the Minister and Councillor Hagan have already put in place some sort of memorandum of understanding between COSLA and the Scottish Government that will work through those processes before a bill ever gets to Parliament, i.e. that when we all start thinking about something, there will be this discussion around, is this something that needs more prescription, if I can use that word in its loosest sense.
It won't be a bill to Parliament, it'll be a statutory instrument.
Well, it could be anything, but yes, my understanding is, and I haven't seen all the words, but there is now a memorandum of understanding between COSLA and the Scottish Government about how that procedure will operate to not get to the place that you're talking about, so that they will have decided all that stuff and agreed it all between them before that ever gets to an SI or however they want to put it in, or guidance or whatever it is. So there will be much more discussion. And I have to say, as RRG, COSLA now sits on RRG, are an active part of our membership. We discuss all these issues with them. And I think we're both now comfortable with our own position on this, that neither of us are going to go out and do anything that we feel hasn't been part of good discussion and consultation before we get to that. And my understanding is, as I said, I haven't seen it, but the Minister and Councillor Hagan, I gather, have now got a memorandum of understanding between the two of them and a protocol about how this will work.
Okay. Can I turn then to forms, because forms are another issue that people design locally. Again, the bill gives powers to prescribe what forms are completed. I suppose my concern is, do you end up with what could be a one-page form turning into a 16-page form because different local authorities need different information to reflect their own local circumstance? Or do you ignore local circumstances and prescribe what information they can base their decisions on?
I guess our experience would be on all sorts of forms, and if I use alcohol licensing, one which we've done the most work on, is that about 95% of forms everybody needs. And what the differences are tend to be at the margins. Now, I think, and you don't get one form. I mean, we have now agreed a set of 13 individual licensing forms for alcohol licences, which cover the whole raft of different things you have to do with them charge licences. So in answer to your question is, no, I don't think it takes a one-page form to 16 pages, because if you get the practitioners who design the forms into a room together, then they will come up with something that, and I'm trying to think, I can't think of one where less than 90% of it was not a common standard across them all. There are things at the margins, but they tend to be at the margins.
Mm-hmm. But if each, take local councils for example, if each local council had 10% of the form that was unique to them,
yep,
that could make quite a big form. If each of them had a different 10%, you double in the size of your form.
It could do, but again, I've not seen anything that would say that's going to happen.
Okay. Can I just ask, and this is slightly, but just given what you're saying, that you've been working, you've changed regulation, things have been more streamlined, do we need Do we need legislation at all? Should this not be maybe done along the basis that you've been working previously by speaking to people, negotiating and coming up with best practice? Do we need a bill to enforce this?
The answer to the question is, I think, yes. I'll use the words of a local council official and answer your question, who I was asked exactly that question recently. And he said, we all agree it's a good thing to do. He said, but knowing that we have to do it, he said, makes it certain that we will do it. And one of the issues he was talking about was, what's in the bill as well, is the desire to make sustainable economic development a duty for people to consider. And his comment was interesting. And what he said was, at committee, people tend to, and we report on the things that we have a duty to report on. We don't necessarily discuss all the other things that may be of interest to us or report on it. So therefore, having it down in writing that we would have to report on certain things, he said, would make it much easier for me as an official to do that. And I think you don't get consistency if you don't have something in legislation. And I'm not sure this legislation is a harsh piece of legislation, or indeed a difficult piece of legislation, because all it says is that from time to time, when we think, all of us think, that we need to put in national processes and national standards in a certain area across Scotland, we will do it. It doesn't give any government the sort of blanket power to do this all the time. There has to be consultation. As I said a minute ago, the Minister and COSLA now have in place a way of doing this. So I just think, yes, it does allow us to then say, here is a way of doing things. What it will then do as well, because it's legislative, is allow the local authority practitioners to get involved in the preparation of bills a lot earlier than they do. One of the criticisms we've had for a long time is that in some bills, officials who are going to enact this really only get involved at the very end rather than the very beginning. If you put in a national standard that's going to come to you folks to be approved, those that are delivering it, the practitioners, are going to have to be involved in this at a very early stage. So yes, I do think you need legislation sometimes to get us to a point where it becomes part of the way we do things, and that is usually governed by rules.
But what about the public that have to, I suppose, live by that regulation? Take, for example, taxi legislation. We were listening to suggestions that already having a pan-local authority taxi licensing regime created difficulties for people who operated, say, in rural areas, who had to gold-plate everything to the urban standard. Is that not going to be the case, that everything gets gold-plated to the highest standard and doesn't reflect local concerns and local circumstances?
Again, I haven't seen that. As we've talked to all the practitioners that work in a whole host of areas over Scotland, when they sit around a table and try and do something nationally, it doesn't get to, well, we'll do everything for the central belt, we'll not do things for rural. They tend to come up with what I would call a very sensible way of doing things that covers everybody. So I haven't seen any reflections in actuality that would substantiate that.
Thank you. Margaret McDougall.
Good morning, gentlemen. Just on the national standards, the Minister's setting the national standards, do you have a view on the potential for conflict, when they are also then going to be dealing with any exceptions or appeals?
I suppose that comes back to the difference between process and decision making. The national standard will only be about the process that goes up to. So if it was a planning application, for example, and you're putting something in planning, the standard would only be about the process of taking it to the planning committee locally. If the planning committee locally then made a decision that somebody else wanted to appeal, then you're appealing the decision, you're not appealing the process. So I don't think there would be conflict in that, and I'll ask Gary to comment on that. I'm just trying to think, because if the process, you're not. Different bodies of people can make a different judgment on any piece of information that comes to them, given the circumstances that they do that. And all we're saying is that the standard should be about the process that brings the information to them. It's not trying then to force them into a different decision. Gary?
Yeah, I'm sort of thinking back to a previous life when I was a solicitor, and one of the tasks I had was dealing with licensing applications. for a supermarket in various different parts of Scotland. And, you know, from our point of view, you know, one of the things that would have made matters a lot easier was, you know, getting back to that, having the one set of forms. But you still anticipate that you're going to get, you know, issues raised and applications being accepted, applications being rejected at licensing committees in different parts of the country, and it's then a matter of fact to deal with those. But in terms of what this bill will do is just make the process a lot easier in terms of getting to that point. But I think, you know, ultimately, if there's any challenges to be made, it'll probably be on the basis of decisions that are made rather than in terms of application of the process.
One area of the bill I think we're quite interested in is this question of the economic duty and how that will interrelate with the other duties on the various regulators. I think Alison Johnson wants to ask about that.
Thank you, Convener. Yes, I notice in the various submissions you've given on the bill, you don't actually touch upon the economic duty at all. Were you surprised to see it in the bill, or was it something that the RRG had discussed previously?
Discussed this many times, but we discussed many duties, so not just the economic one. And I guess the view is the one I expressed in the local official. This is about just making sure that people do take economic. And I was surprised, I have to say, when I heard it from this local authority official who said, you know, if we have a duty to look at health issues for an alcohol licence, if we report on that when we put it out. He said, well, since we don't have to, it's not a duty to look at the economic impact of it. Sometimes we may discuss it or we may not. And to me, there's a great thing about balance in this. So this is not about saying, and I will say that quite firmly, about saying that the economic impact should take preference or hierarchy over everything else. It's about just demonstrating, it's about demonstrating visibly that it has been considered. So I think that's where the government wanted to put it in. We've looked at it. We've had lots of discussions with regulators over the years about this balance between economic impact and environmental safety, health and safety, all sorts of other things. And I guess what this does, that given the government has, the current government has sustainable economic development at the heart of its policy, then they would wish to see that considered formally by any decision that was being made on licensing or other planning and all sorts of things. So I have no issues with it, and I have even less issues now having listened to people in local authorities about how that will make them have to broadcast it. When I go back to my comparison, this was a true case of the two Tesco's in Paisley Road. The gentleman from Tesco said that would have made our understanding of that decision a lot more simpler if they had actually written in the judgment on that case why they had done it on economic grounds. But because they only wrote it on health grounds, because that's the only duty they have to do, Tesco couldn't understand the difference. Had they put in the economic argument, then they would have understood the difference. So I think it will make it more visible.
Okay. In your annual report of last year, you made it very clear that you thought regulators were making great progress working towards an enabling culture. So I'm assuming that your answer to Rhoda Grant about legislation making it certain that something would be covered, you feel the same here? Because certainly last week, Dennis Robertson and myself heard from someone who was involved in environmental and trading standards. He felt that he didn't see the point in having the economic duty in the bill and felt that it would be better deleted, that there were already concordats in place that covered this. You know, he pointed out that no environmental officer would want to see a restaurant, for example, closed down for more than a day, that they understand that this is people's livelihoods and businesses. But you obviously feel that this is something you want to see in legislation.
Yes, but it would be extremely unfair for me to say that was a view held of everybody on RRG. It's not. We do have people that feel exactly the same as your environmental health officer. But on balance, I think now I'm moved as chair, but it won't move some of my members, to say that I think putting it in to this to become a duty will bring greater visibility. But I do agree with you. I'm not disagreeing with you to say that it is already out there and has been, and indeed has been the argument around very many changes in regulation over the last 20 or 30 years, which has been around economic benefit. So it's out there. But given that it is felt that we want to have this balance visibly seen, if I can put it that way, then it needs to be put through in legislation. And I guess it's the same, some of the stuff that's in the bill that belongs to SEPA, around the way that they want to alter their fee structure, etc., is unless they have the legislative power to do that, they can't do some of the enabling that they want to do. Because if you're going to allow good people to pay less and bad people to pay more, you need to have the visibility and the structures around that to do that. So I think there are some things you have to do in the world of government and legislation, that if you want things to be seen to be done, the only way you can do it is to legislate for it.
Okay. There obviously are those who believe there's a conflict here. You know, organisations like Scottish Natural Heritage. We have a submission from Professor Colin Reid. There's obviously debates about what sustainable economic growth means. In your earlier response there, you spoke about economic development. Do you think there are any risks here, given that there are different views as to what sustainable economic growth actually means?
I'll start and then I'll pass to Gary while he's thinking. The answer to the question is, as long as we're all sensible human beings, the answer to the question is no. So I rely on...
If only that
and I think that's one of the things. I guess one of the things that we found in this long discussion about the balance between the economy and the environment is how you apply common sense to it. And I guess a simple answer to that would be, as long as we continue to do that, then there shouldn't be that conflict. But I'll ask Gary to maybe comment on that.
No, I was just really thinking along the lines of, you know, the need to achieve some degree of culture change in order to make better regulation a reality throughout Scotland. And, you know, I think we've, as a group, have often held SEPA up as an example of positive change in that respect. And that's been, you know, as a result of, you know, sensible practices, strong leadership, and a change in focus, you know, away from the policeman, if, you know, as Russell says, and more towards, you know, working with businesses to achieve compliance and better results as a result. And I think that is one of the reasons why we need a legislative approach, because even within SEPA, that's a big organisation. It requires a lot to get that particular ship to change tack. And you know, if we look at, for example, the planning system back in the 2006 Act, there was a lot of talk then about change in terms of the culture in planning, and I think it did require legislation at that time to try and get that in motion. I think we're still working towards that, and obviously there's aspects of this bill which continue that path towards changing culture and planning. But I think we do need some sort of legislative imperative for culture change, and also a legislative focus on the economy as being central to what we're doing.
Can I ask one more question, Convener? Is there any sense in which this could be, just say you have a very contentious decision to make. Let's look at the many decision where a SSSI is now a golf course. If you're relying on bodies like SNH, for example, to give a view and to weigh up the pros and cons of, you know, environmental sustainability against economic benefits, do you feel in some ways that politicians are almost saying, I'd rather someone else made that decision? You know, if you're asking other organisations to weigh up those decisions instead of that becoming a decision for politicians to make?
I'm not sure what's wrong with asking your experts to make a decision.
But you don't feel that there's any conflict there between, you know, protecting the environment and making...
No, I mean, in all the discussions we've had over some very sensitive issues over the years with people like SNH and SEPA and RSPB and all not just government bodies but NGOs as well, we've had very sensible discussions over that balance, and sometimes the balance goes down on the environmental side and sometimes it goes down on the economic side. So no, I don't see that. Well, let me put it that way. I haven't seen that conflict. I haven't seen that conflict not been resolved in a sensible way that satisfied both of the people that sat on either side of that fence.
Dennis Robertson wants to go into a supplementary.
Just a point of clarification. If I understand you correctly, you're suggesting that you're advocating legislation, which is absolutely fine, but you're also suggesting that it's open to interpretation.
Said that, did I?
No, well, so I'm a bit confused at times, because I think at times you're saying that there's if, buts and maybes occasionally, and we've got local process and we've got national standards. I think you're also suggesting that that there could be open to interpretation, because you can move away from national to local, and when you're looking at some of the regulatory reform aspects, you're saying it could be open to interpretation. Am I wrong?
You'd have to give an example where you think I've said that.
It was when you were answering Alison's question. I was a bit confused when I thought you were saying that we're looking at people maybe applying common sense sometimes. That to me, it suggests to me that would be open to interpretation, looking at individuals.
No, I think, all right, well, then let me rephrase what I was meaning. I think the question was about, does the legislation push people in one direction or the other? And I think what I will now say is no. As long as you apply common sense, and all the common sense I've seen to the interpretation of legislation, then if it's good legislation, then no, you don't get into those conflicts and you don't get into those less differences, because good legislation, if you think about it sensibly, drives you all, or should drive us all in the same direction. So no, I don't see that conflict or misinterpretation being done at all.
Okay, thank you for that.
Okay, brief supplementary from Chick Brody.
I'm struggling with that as well. I see no, and we dwelt a lot on the word consistency. I mean, what happens to the potential conflict that a minister who has been involved in determining national standards then listens to applications for exception to them and advice, which, as you say, might go down the economic route or might go down the environmental route? Where is how do we achieve the consistency, particularly when you're suggesting that we need national standards?
I think it comes back to, we started this discussion about, we're talking about here as national standards about process. And I think Gary's example he gave of a lawyer putting forward evidence to a judge or a court is all, how you interpret, each of us in this room could sit and look at the same piece of information and from our own point of view come up with a different interpretation. But that's the decision part of standards, and we're not at all saying anything in the bill to do with how people make decisions. National standards are about process, are about saying that the way we do things in certain areas should be the same across Scotland.
Well, surely they're the backdrop to a decision being made.
No, I don't think that's at all. I think what process is about bringing forward information that you require to make that decision. And all we're saying is across Scotland in certain areas it would be really useful if we brought forward that information in the same way.
Okay, thank you.
To go back to the duty about sustainable economic growth, the bill has provisions that it would be, that a regulator must contribute to it insofar as it is not inconsistent with the exercise of the other functions. Do you think that makes it almost a secondary duty? And if so, is that a good thing or a bad thing?
I think, if anything, it probably makes it an equal duty. I think by bringing it up to a duty rather than a power, and we could go on forever about what's the difference between the duties and powers, then no, I don't. I think if anything it equals it. I don't think it might get boots it higher or lower.
Yeah, I think anything that adds in terms of giving the regulator, in this case, maybe encouraging them to take a more holistic view, I think has got to be positive. I mean, one of the things, I mean, Russell mentioned earlier, the business and regulatory impact assessment. I think that's been successful in terms of ensuring that government takes a more holistic view of business in terms of the application of a regulation. So I think anything that gives the incentive to take a more holistic view, I think has got to be welcomed.
I mean, it's been interesting, if I can maybe just carry on from where Gary is, about when we've looked at how the first round and the second round of business regulatory impact assessments have worked, and the feedback we've had from both businesses and government officials on those, and they've both been very positive. And when RRG started these, they were a means to an end. And the end is about getting officials and businesses to talk more about what it is they want to do before they do it, if I can put it that way. And BRIA now makes it mandatory you have to do, and it's actually then a very good example of how a rule takes you to the consequence. And we've all said in RRG that where we want to get to in BRIA is that, in fact, you don't need a BRIA, because officials routinely, when they're starting looking at a new piece of policy, will go and find 12 companies that this is going to impact off and go and have a conversation with them. At the moment, we've had to make that a rule, because the only way sometimes you get the horse to go to water to understand it's good to drink is to actually put a rule in place first that allows you to go down that road. And that's what BRIAs are all about. And it's interesting, the businesses that have replied have said it was very time consuming, it was really interesting. Did we think it was a waste of time? No, we didn't think it was a waste of time at all, because we now understand where the policymaker comes from in this as much as the business comes from. And that's what we want to do, is encourage a much more onward, greater exchange of information between government and businesses on regulation and rules and how we do everything. But sometimes you have to put the rule in place first to get people to understand what it is you're trying to get to.
Some of the advisory bodies that feed into the planning process already have, I don't know if it's formalised in statute, but they certainly have duties to consider economic impact. For example, controversial developments in heritage properties can be justified on economic grounds. Is that a similar model to what we would now see from regulators or advisory bodies more widely?
Yeah, I think so, and I think SEPA already have it in for things like doing small hydro schemes, things like that as well. I mean, interesting enough, as they've gone through that licensing process, the balance has been about 50-50 between those that have gone down the environment, they've been turned down for environmental reasons, or those that have been said yes to for the economic reasons. So the answer to the question is probably yes.
And last question, to illustrate the benefits of this, you've referred to that Tesco example quite a few times. That's a place where there's a clear benefit in explanatory grounds. Can you suggest an example where the decision would be different as a result of this duty?
That's a good idea. Yes. Go on, you do it. Could you remember more about it than I do?
No, one example that springs to mind there would be the fire safety regulations from 2-3 years back.
Breakfasts.
Yes.
Yeah, where essentially at a very early stage, there was a detection that the application was particularly onerous, maybe on smaller businesses, B&Bs, small hotels, etc., and that the regulation far outweighed the risk in some of these instances. And that was an area where we did go back, looked at it as the RRG, and the government went back and made some changes to the regulations. I mean, perhaps if some of that impact had been considered at an earlier stage, we'd have ended up with better regulation in the first place that would have allowed businesses to comply with a relevant set of standards. That maybe we wouldn't have had to come back and re-examine that at a later date.
Yeah, and that's actually right. And one of the consequences of that was the understanding in the end, and it was led by little Jimmy Campbell from the fire service, who said it's not just the legislation that's not awfully clear in this, the guidance wasn't also. And you said you're trying to get fire officers to do something they're not trained to, which is make a risk assessment on a B&B and ask some sensible questions. So part of it was not just a change in regulation, but a change in the training for those that were going to have to implement the regulation around how they went, when they went and knocked on somebody's door and asked, you know, do you have a B&B? The first question was he asked, and how often are you a B&B? And if they say, only every time the Open Golf Championship comes to my area, then you treat them differently to somebody who has 3 people in every week. And so it was a combination of that, Gary's quite correct, of the change in the legislation plus the changing in the training process that I think we've now moved that forward a long way. But so that, yes, it's a very good example, so thank you, Gary.
Okay, thanks. Just before I bring in Mike McKenzie, I just want to go back to this point we've been discussing about the interface between national standards and local discretion. And what you're saying, the national standards is very much just about a process. I was just looking at the draft bill. Section 1.1 of the bill says, Scottish ministers may by regulations make any provision which they consider will encourage or improve consistency in the exercise by regulators of regulatory functions. But if you look at subsection 5, regulatory functions is defined inter alia as, if you look at paragraph A, subparagraph 2, setting standards or outcomes in relation to an activity. So regulatory functions means you can set outcomes. Does that not just go beyond process?
If we go back to alcohol licensing and knife crimes, one of the things we've always done in RRG, and I think, again, going back to looking at where economic impact is government starts with a policy what? You know, what is it we're trying to achieve from a bill? And in terms of alcohol licensing, it was trying to impact on the amount of alcohol that was taken. In knife crimes, it was trying to take on knife crimes. You then put in a piece of legislation, which is the how. And one of the things that RRG tries to do all the time is to see that does the how give you the what? And in a lot of cases, that's not the case. And I would say, and I'll probably get things thrown at me in a minute for saying this, but in terms of both alcohol licensing and knife crimes bill, I'm not sure how the bill satisfied the what, if I can put it that way. So I think it's very important for a bill to actually understand what is the outcome you're trying to achieve at the beginning. So if all this is an ability of the Scottish Government to set in place some very hard outcomes that will then drive all the other process. So you can't then put in place, hopefully, a process that won't give you a different outcome from what it is you're trying to achieve. If you start off with no outcome, then you could wander around merrily all over the place. You know, so I understand where you're going at, but I'm not sure it's totally inconsistent for it to be in there.
Okay, Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. And can I ask you, Professor Griggs, do you feel it's possible, if we are able to effect a better regulatory regime, is it possible to achieve enhanced sustainable economic growth while still safeguarding the environment, communities, quality of life for individuals? Do you feel that's, in general terms, possible?
I think the examples I gave earlier on, where we've been working with all the chemical companies in Grangemouth, who started off, I would guess, in these meetings, sceptical about how some of these balances could be achieved. And it was interesting at the last meeting, which is not the last meeting, but the meeting we had a couple of weeks ago, that one of the gentlemen who run INEOS said, you know, the great thing about meeting in these multilateral forums to discuss these issues is I now understand better how everybody else around this table operates and what their own views are on that. So that when we're having these wider conversations on, you know, why I'm concerned about am I going to have to play for flood defences at Grangemouth, what the Council's view is, what SEPA's view is. And out of that, we've come to quite an interesting discussion on that. which SEPA now are taking forward, which is one of the things that become quite contentious, was how regulators and government portray their information on their own websites internationally. And the example was given by Ineos of, you know, when one of our analysts back in China starts to evaluate my business plan, they will scan government websites across the world. And indeed, the representative from SDI who was there said that's quite common as well, that people will scan government or regulator web. So therefore, how you depict it. Currently, the only map on the SEPA website shows Grangemouth under 10 feet of water in the flood, because it's legally only bound to show the map on the 200-year event. Now, by the end of the year, that will not be the case. They will have 3 maps on their site that shows what's likely to happen, what's a really extreme event, and what's so there'll be a medium, high, and low.
Yep.
So it's about, in those discussions, trying to say to people, by just changing some of the minor things you do, you can have a real impact on competition and economic development. And that, to me, is the most simple and easiest one I've seen recently, about how RRG and others have had an impact on that. And it was a realisation about, and the SEPA said quite justifiably, but that's not what we are there to do. And what industry said back, no, we agree with you, but that's not how others see you. So therefore, in terms of us all working together to make sure that we present the best possible case, to give you that balance, that's how we do that.
Yeah, and in this question, I'm really just looking for a one-word answer. The effect of this bill when it's implemented, would you expect that that will increase sustainable economic growth?
Yes.
Thank you. If I can just move on to another area that's not been touched on. Another area that's not been touched on, we've talked about, you know, geographical consistency and so on. One big area of concern for me, not least because some commentators are suggesting that the recovery, when it comes, will arise from the small business sector. And it's therefore the issue of concern is proportionality. And we took some informal evidence directly from small business, some small businesses, which I think was very interesting, because very often it's lobby groups, representative organisations and so on. We don't often get the chance to hear directly from small businesses. Interestingly, one of the requests, which I think were bound to go along with, is they wanted to preserve their anonymity. And that struck a chord with me, because I hear from small businesses all the time who struggle with regulation, both the complexity of it and sometimes the culture in which it's implemented. And I just wondered, you talked about how far the bill advances this and promotes proportionality. I'm not clear within the bill what actual mechanisms there are to achieve that end, although it's one of the stated aims of the bill.
I think engagement is clearly been one of the areas where, in various aspects of better regulation over the past few years, it's engagement between business and government and the regulator that's really brought the best results. I think the bill has the potential, certainly, to increase that kind of engagement. And again, go back to what the business and regulatory impact assessment has been able to achieve. It's when you're on a path towards better regulation. I mean, it's easy for ourselves and business organisations to say regulation bad. I don't think too many of us say that anymore. I think it's not about the number of regulations out there. It's not about, and it's not a numbers game. It's about ensuring we have the best possible regulation and we have the best possible engagement, so that we have a process where...
Sorry, could I just stop you there? I'm not clear on reading the bill. I'm not even sure if the word engagement is anywhere in the text of the bill. On the issue of proportionality, are there specific teeth there? Is there a specific mechanism in the bill? And I absolutely agree with you about the concept of engagement. That's a virtuous concept. But where in the bill is the mechanisms that will lead us to a more proportionate implementation of regulation.
Well, I think even the very fact that, you know, we're looking at potentially national standards in terms of processes has got to be a benefit for a number of businesses, particularly those businesses that trade across local government areas. You know, to take, you know, Ayrshire as an example, you know, you've got 3 local authorities there potentially, depending on what you're looking for. You've got 3 different sets of forms to fill out. I mean, even that simple process of having one standard form that you can...
Can I perhaps tell you a wee story that will illustrate what I'm getting at?
Pretty short.
It's very often a complaint that I get from constituents that regulators seem to almost look the other way, or have very reasonable and understandable relationships with either public sector organisations whom they have to regulate, and I'm thinking about SEPA and Scottish Water, or big business. And that these guys have at least a kind of reasonable and equal chance of dealing with regulators and getting through the minefield of regulation, whereas the small business, labours under a huge degree of complexity and sometimes a culture that's less enlightened, I think, than any of us would wish to see.
I don't think any bill will ever solve that. I really don't. I've been involved now in small business, and he was chair of the SME Council in the UK for 5 years, and that's a perennial problem. And I don't think you'll ever make every small business happy with legislation. One of the interesting things, RRG, since it started in 2004, continually asks businesses to come forward with regulation they're unhappy with. And I guess over the last, whatever it is, coming up for 10 years next year, I could probably, without taking my socks off, tell you the number of specific cases that people have actually come forward with. I think one of the challenges we have with small firms is making sure, again, back to the process that we have works for them. Because you're quite correct. We looked last year at a case to do with biocides, the new biocide regulations in the EU, which had been put together by people like BASF, huge chemical companies. And they were going to have a huge impact on a whole load of SMEs across Scotland. Now, we've managed, working with HSE, we think, to get a lot of that mitigated. But I don't think any bill will ever answer your question you've said. Now, the challenge I have with teeth is you've got to figure out who you want to bite. And
sometimes just having them is
well, I think one of the challenges you have with regulators is I think one of the discussions we had years and years ago with SEPA was enabling means trusting people to enabling that I come to you as SEPA and say, you know what this new bill means, you know what this new regulation means, you know how to enact it, yes. I will trust you to go and implement it. And then I will come back and audit you from time to time to make sure you do it. If you have teeth as a policeman, what you go along and ask is, will you please show me how you've obeyed the law? And that to me is a different and probably the wrong way you want to go down with a company. And we've tried hard to move it to the former rather than the latter, if I can put it that way.
Yeah. And just one final question, which is an easy one. Part of the bill is about planning fees, enhanced planning fees, with the suggestion that planning authorities that don't provide a quality of service perhaps will lose this ability to charge the enhanced fees. So there'll be a financial penalty there. One of the things that strikes me, and I'm a Highlands and Islands regional member, so I deal with interface with a number of planning authorities that with quite obviously different performance standards or quality standards, and yet they all seem capable of generating a report card that gives them a very, very high 97% rating, self-generating these report cards. Now, the understanding is that if planning authorities don't provide a quality of service, and bearing in mind it is a very, very contentious area, how on earth will we manage to assess the quality of standard from one planning authority to the next?
That's a very difficult question for us to answer. I mean, I think in general terms, you know, the prospect that an increase in planning fees would be accompanied by an increase in performance. In general terms, that's something our members are reasonably comfortable with. You know, if you're assured that you're going to get something for your money, I think our members are going to be relatively comfortable with that. I think, you know, you've got an issue with business rates at the moment where we're being asked to pay 22% more over the current spending period without anything material in return. That's a different story. But I think in terms of planning, if we can be assured that there are going to be material changes for the better in return for increased investment in the planning fees, then I think that's something that most of the members I've spoken to have been relatively comfortable with. But I think you're right. I mean, I think it is difficult to compare planning performance between different planning bodies, and that's something that will have to be squared before the new rules can really bite.
Yeah, and I guess the last thing RRG would want is to set up a regulator to do that. And we have to be careful sometimes that we don't create little industries to go away and do some of these things. So I think both of us understand your concern in that area.
Okay, very brief final supplementary.
Yes, just coming back to, if I may, Professor Griggs, it depends on who you want to bite. In terms of achieving a level playing field between large business and small business, I want to make sure that we do bite. Again, at that conference I was at, the managing director of Auxera, it suggested we could either be lumpers or splitters. Lumpers being favouring a single organisation to take charge of not just regulation but competition law. Can I ask that when you're going forward, and we will certainly do this, that you look at the impact not just of international competitiveness but also the fairness of competitiveness between big business and small business, and in terms of how we apply the regulation?
We will, and I mean, we're already doing that. An example of biocides that we gave, we're already now trying to influence back into Europe to make sure that they don't just take the views of, you see, what happens is they will go to trade associations, basically, and that's why we've made it very clear in our BRIA and the Business Regulatory Impact Assessment that we don't think that trade associations are the right people to ask. You have to ask individual businesses. The challenge we have with a lot of the European legislation is they go to the trade associations. The trade associations tend to be staffed by large organisations, because the point that you are making, they tend to have the people and the resources to do that. And therefore, one of the things we are pressing very hard for is to make sure that the voice of small businesses is heard in those. It's challenging. It's not without its difficulties, but we are 100% on your side in that.
I think we can draw the session to a close. Thank you, Professor Griggs. Gary Clark, thank you very much for coming along. You've given us a lot to consider over the coming weeks. I'm grateful to you for your time this morning, and we'll have a short suspension to allow a changeover. Right, if we can reconvene with our second panel on the Regulatory Reform Scotland Bill, I'd like to welcome Roger Burton, who's the Programme Manager for Wildlife and Social and Economic Development Programmes at Scottish Natural Heritage, Riddle Graham, who's Director of Partnerships at Visit Scotland, and Martin Tyson, Head of Registration at the Office of the Scottish Charity Regulator. Welcome all. Now, I think before we get into questions, I'll just invite you all to say a very, very short introduction, if you would, to your evidence. Maybe start with you, Roger Burton.
Okay, thank you, Selina. We're pleased to have the opportunity to be here today to present our evidence to the committee. We welcome the overarching purpose of the Regulatory Reform Bill to achieve a range of social, economic and environmental benefits by improving regulatory functions. Our written submission sets out the basis of our evidence, and I won't repeat it now. I'll be pleased to answer any questions members have on this that would help them understand the role we play in the wider regulatory framework and how we approach it. Thank you.
Thank you. Riddle Graham.
Yeah, again, delighted to be here and to provide evidence. Just some context to Visit Scotland's work and my role in particular. My team is responsible for all the external partnership working that Visit Scotland needs to deliver its overarching objective, and my team engages with a very wide range of external partners. Specifically, my team delivers our world-leading quality assurance scheme, which covers accommodation and visitor attractions linked to a very strong advisory and signposting service. We also engage with businesses commercially to sell commercial marketing opportunities. And in the past 12 months, I've led a piece of work to create a new national tourism development framework, which is aimed at influencing the planning system nationally, regionally and locally in relation to tourism and its importance to the tourism economy. And just to say that as an organisation, we are not a statutory regulatory body. Thank you.
Thanks, Convener. I'm very glad to be here and glad to have the opportunity to give our evidence to you. The Scottish Charity Regulator regulates over 23,000 charities in Scotland. It's a very diverse sector. We welcome very much the principles that are set out in the bill, the regulatory principles. They're very much largely the same principles that underpin the 2005 Charities and Trustee Investment Scotland Act 2005, which is our sort of legal framework for our activities. I won't sort of repeat what's in our written evidence. I think our main observations on the bill are I suppose, more questions really, and we just are slightly unclear as to how directly the bill sort of bears on our activity and how far it replicates powers that are already in the legislation that controls us. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, thank you. Some of you, I think, will have heard at the tail end of the previous session that there are a number of kind of areas of particular interest to committee members. One is this question of the national standards and the opt-out and how that's going to work in practice. We're interested in the question of the resource implications for regulators and public bodies. And finally, this question of the economic duty and whether there's a conflict between the economic duty and the other duties on regulators, for example, environmental issues. So I think we'll tease some of that out as we go through the questions. Now, we have three very distinct viewpoints on the panel, so I would ask members if they would, rather than just throwing out a general question, it'd be very helpful if we could direct them to a specific member of the panel. And then if any of you want to come in response to a question asked to somebody else, please catch my eye and I'll bring you in as we can. And because we've got a panel with three different interests and quite a wide range of subjects to cover, I'd ask members if they would to be short and focused in their questions, that we could have short and focused answers. That would be very helpful in terms of getting through the issues in the time that's available. So I think we'll start on this question of the national standards, and I'll bring in Margaret McDougall.
And good morning, gentlemen. This is a general question to all of you, really, on whether or not the power needs to be directed at bodies like Visit Scotland, SNH, and the Oscar.
Who'd like to start?
Certainly, in the two areas that I referred to in my opening remarks, in relation to quality assurance and also in relation to the planning work that planning authorities carry out in relation to tourism. The function that we've carried out for over 30 years now in relation to quality assurance has worked extremely well on a voluntary basis. We've got the highest penetration level in relation to our quality scheme of any part of the United Kingdom. And funnily enough, our colleagues in Northern Ireland who've had a compulsory element of quality assurance have just adopted our scheme in the past 12 months, and we're delivering it on their behalf because they found that a compulsory element doesn't really work in terms of freezing standards. In relation to the planning framework, I think what's been very encouraging from my point of view is that we've engaged with all local authorities in Scotland in developing this framework, and we've been very clear that we wanted to work with them rather than impose anything as part of this plan and this framework. And that has been welcomed immensely by COSLA and by the 30 of the 32 local authorities that responded. So I think the principle of working in partnership rather than imposing, certainly in these two areas, I think works really well from a tourism perspective.
From our point of view, we're a national regulator. We regulate charities across Scotland. So I think we find it harder to see how that's that driver of trying to get geographical consistency across several bodies doing the same kind of regulation in different geographical areas. You know, I understand the drivers for that, say, across local authorities. It's not quite clear to us how directly that applies to us as a national regulator. Turning it round, obviously we have an interest in things like the licensing of public benevolent collections, you know, shaking tins on the street, which is done by largely by the local authorities, and obviously we have an interest in, and we're glad to see anything that enables that to be more consistently done.
Roger.
Yeah, well, again, picking up on the same point, as a national as a national body playing a role at local and national levels, there are aspects of this that we hope have little bearing on us. I mean, there will always be issues within any larger organisation of individual consistency at the individual level, but we put in place processes to address that. We also play a role providing guidance within the planning system, and so again, I think, you know, there are areas where we can see this actually having potential benefit by providing added weight to that guidance within the process.
Right. Thanks for that. But just on SNH in your submission, you quote from section 41, where you hope that the proposals for planning authorities' functions, charging and fees will allow them to develop their own capacity without increasing their expectation on yourselves, for example, around response times. Now, why do you think that you should be exempted in that?
I don't think SNH should be exempted from that, but our capacity, our resources are constrained. If there is a vast increase in throughput, we will have to look very carefully at how we can play our part in the system. If that throughput has been resourced by increased capacity in local authorities through getting additional resources and fees, which allows them to process agreement planning applications faster, we will have to look very closely at the level of input we can provide to those planning applications in order to manage within our fixed resource.
Right. On keeping on the same sort of situation with national standards and opt-outs, do you think there's sufficient scope for local opt-out from national standards in the bill?
I'm not certain how far the bill goes that way. I think this is where we see the Code of Practice actually having a significant role to play in helping define how you deal with local decisions which need to properly reflect local circumstances with national standards.
Yeah, because the bill is not clear on just exactly what the criteria is for opt-out, so do you think it should be more defined?
I'm not sure that I can answer the question as to whether the bill should go there. I think there's always an option between how far you go in within the legislation and how far you can deal with that through the codes of practice and other mechanisms.
Do other panel members have a view on that?
I don't really have a view. I'm not close enough to that from the day-to-day work that we're involved with. And this new National Tourism Development Framework is very much at its very early stage. We've just been through the consultation process and we're just pulling together the final version. But I see the way that it would work effectively in relation to tourism and planning is by working very closely at local level with the right people around the table. And it's having them there to make decisions that are right for the local economy that would make it work. And every part of Scotland, as we all know, is different. And I think that would be reflected in the way that we would like to see this happen at local level.
Our involvement with planning is very, very marginal. It tends to be not much at all.
Okay, thank you.
Mike McKenzie.
Thank you, Convener. My questions really are for Mr. Tyson, and largely because, you know, you very obviously are a regulatory body, but you're unusual, I suppose, in the fact that it's a non-ministerial department. And also, I suppose, you've kind of drawn attention to yourselves in terms of, you know, you say in the submission that, or I get the strong sense that you feel that you shouldn't be on Schedule 1. Could you explain why you think that's the case?
I don't think we have a particularly sort of strong sense of that. I think, as I said at the beginning, it's more of a sort of querying how directly some of this you know, bears on us. I think firstly, as a national regulator, you know, that geographical consistency issue, it's not clear how that bears. The other side of it is the way that we were established. I think we were established as a sort of non-ministerial department, which is probably a fairly rare beast still. And I think looking back to how that was done and you know, the consultation that surrounded that, I think there was a sort of driver there for having a regulator that stood slightly to the side of government and you know, could be seen as independent in, you know, in terms of the sort of regulatory decisions it makes and its sort of operational you know, processes. And I think there are very specific mechanisms set out in the 2005 Act that Parliament sort of considered when it was thinking about you know, specifically about charity regulation, whereby, you know, ministers have the levers, if it seems sensible, to look at how regulation should be done and to tweak how regulation should be done. I think we're concerned at how it might be perceived if there is a more open-ended power to you know, influence you know, the way that we go about our regulatory business.
Yeah, but that begs the question that's often asked about regulators, but I think it's particularly apt in your case. Who regulates the regulator? So who regulates Oscar?
Well, in our case, it's Parliament. You know, we account to yourselves, and you know, in terms of how we go about our normal business. I mean, other sides of it, obviously, you know, in terms of the sort of financial side, and as a public body, you know, we you know, account to ministers for the money that we get. But in terms of our regulatory activities, you know, we report to Parliament.
Right. Okay. And one of the stated aims of the bill is about proportionality.
Yeah.
I take it you would sign up to that stated aim of the bill.
Very much so, and proportionality is obviously one of the regulatory principles. It's built into the 2005 Act as well.
Yeah, and yet from your written submission, it would seem that, you know, I get the impression that you really don't want to be part of this because, you know, you're already doing pretty much everything that it suggests in the bill.
I don't think we would, you know, in any way suggest that we're you know, sort of perfect or that we're there. I think we have a sort of very strong consciousness of the need to be proportionate, the need to be consistent, and obviously there's sometimes a tension between the two, and, you know, the other sort of principles as well, you know, fairness and targeting of activity, which is one of the things that goes along with proportionality. I think the other thing I'd maybe sort of point out is there are other mechanisms, that I suppose aren't necessarily directly about accountability, but they're about ways of sort of challenging our decisions. There is the procedure for internal review. There's the Scottish Charity Appeal Panel, and obviously eventually our decisions can be appealed to the Court of Session. And there again, proportionality and thinking about the cases that we've had at Scottish Charity Appeal Panel, proportionality is something where they are very much holding us to account and testing us. And similarly with consistency, one of the key things that any of our decisions, any of our regulator decisions will be tested on is consistency. Is it the same decision as you made last year in similar circumstances? Consistency with legal precedent and the rest of it.
I would really have to question the effectiveness of that, given the number of complaints I've had about Oscar from very, very small charities who only have charitable status really because funding agencies often make that a prerequisite of funding. And in fact, the situation seems so bad that a number of these very small charities have asked me not to raise these issues formally with you because they're so frightened of Oscar. And so the evidence that I have seems to suggest to me that far from being removed from Schedule 1, I think you need to be on there at least twice. And it gives me great concern that your approach is that, no, this shouldn't apply to us. We don't want to be part of that.
I think
do you have any advice to offer for very small charities who feel that they've been disproportionately dealt with, for very minor housekeeping issues, made to feel like criminals as if they're absconding with large amounts of charitable proceeds and so on by Oscar? What mechanism is there for them to seek redress?
Where we've made a decision that's reviewable, they can obviously ask us to review it, and then we go to the more sort of formal mechanisms. I think what I would generally say there is we are looking increasingly to go out and engage with small charities. I was up in Orkney last week talking to a lot of small charities in the islands, local development trusts, village halls and the like. I think life is very difficult for charity trustees of small charities for all sorts of reasons. We don't intend regulation to be something that makes life more difficult for them. There are certain sort of basics in charity law and in charity regulation that charity trustees must comply with, but we are concerned to have a proportionate approach. We have made recommendations to Scottish ministers to make regulations in the past to enable the approach to be more proportionate. An example would be the one that we've given in the written evidence about charity reorganisation, which can be a real sort of burden for small trusts where they've got outdated trust deeds that make life very difficult for trustees. They can't recruit new trustees, they can't use their money in the way that they might want to do. And we have made some, we worked with Scottish ministers there to try and have a more proportionate approach to that. Similarly, with the issues around submission of charity accounts and annual returns, what we've tried to do is simplify life there. We reduced the annual return to sort of basically one page of A4 a couple of years ago. We are alive to the concerns of trustees in small charities. I'm concerned that those sort of concerns have been raised with you. I think that the first thing that we would say to trustees who are feeling like that is to speak to us.
Yeah, as I've explained, a lot of them are so intimidated that they don't even want me to raise it formally with you, which really concerns me. And it concerns me because I'm sure you'll agree that the social enterprise sector is a growing sector within our economy. Many are, if not all social enterprises tend to be charities, and that therefore there's an economic effect of regulation not being proportionate perhaps and inhibiting people from getting involved in charities.
I mean the social enterprise side is an interesting one because there are social enterprises that are very clearly charitable and fall squarely within the charitable sector. There are social enterprises at the other end that don't, that there are sort of more sort of businesses with a sort of social conscience, if you like, and wouldn't want to be charities. And the issue that we sometimes have there is just where the sort of boundary of what's charitable and social enterprise, how those interact. Again, I think that the best we can do there is to be out there and speaking to charities, to social enterprises, speaking to the people that represent those sectors, and trying to tailor the kind of regulation that we do to their needs.
Yeah. And just one final question. It used to be that charities were regulated by HMRC prior to Oscar being set up. Are you aware of any areas of conflict between yourselves and HMRC?
We tend to work quite closely with HMRC, and the working relationships are good. I suppose that there's a fundamental issue there, which is that HMRC, in recognising charities and deciding whether charities get tax reliefs, they operate using English tax law. Now, that's very similar to the Scottish law. It's very similar to what's in the 2005 Act, but it's not quite the same. And there can be sort of areas around the edges, and one of those areas being social enterprise and development trusts and the like, where the English law is not quite the same as what the Scots law has to say. And there can be tension there.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. Ruther Grant.
The supplementary on that, and I suppose going back to why Oscar's included in the bill. I mean, is it not true that Oscar demands organisations to report in certain ways annually, and that can coincide with organisations having, if they're registered as companies, for example, having to report as well? Would it not, I mean, is there not a scope for Oscar to be working with the other organisations to streamline regulations so people need one form of accounting rather than, I'm quite aware of people having to prepare different returns for different organisations, creating more work and having to conform to the different regulations?
The requirement to report annually to Oscar, that's a legislative requirement. It's not something that we've sort of made up. But
you could streamline it with other reporting agencies to make sure that people could maybe put together one set of reports rather than several.
And that we do work with the likes of Companies House, with the and with other regulators such as the Scottish Housing Regulator, to streamline where we can. The other development there's been in the past few years is the Scottish Charitable Incorporated Organisation. That's I suppose a regulatory form. A form of incorporation that's specifically aimed at charities, which means they don't have to be registered with Companies House, and there is only the only return that they produce is to us. I would say with a lot of the very small charities, the unincorporated charities and the trusts, they are only reporting to us, and we have tried as hard as we can to streamline the content and the form of the report and allow them to report online. And reduce the burden where we can for the very small charities.
But is the scope of the bill not to streamline reporting to different organisations? I think that's what we've been hearing very clearly when you're completing different forms for different organisations. Mm-hmm. The real aim of the bill is to simplify that for the people that are doing that, and would that not then be very helpful to have Oscar involved in that?
Yes, indeed, but I think that's something we do already. We have memorandum of understanding with Companies House, with the Scottish Housing Regulator, which is one of the other areas where we have a big overlap. There is, scope in the bill for us to delegate some of our functions, and for instance, with the churches, where some of the denominations have. Are designated religious charities, there's scope for us to sort of withdraw from some of our functions in respect to those charities. So we do that as far as we can. I think that there is a sort of limit to that, because different regulators do different jobs, and there is there's a sort of minimum requirement to do what we're required to do in terms of our regulatory role, which is not quite the same as Companies House role. They're a registrar of companies, that they're interested in the role of directors and the people fulfilling their sort of fiduciary role as directors. We have a slightly different sort of slant on regulation. We're interested in trustee duties and people complying with the charity test.
Okay, just to move the discussion on a bit, looking at other issues around some of the resource implications and infrastructure questions, I'm going to bring in Dennis Robertson.
Good morning, gentlemen. Perhaps I could start with Visit Scotland, but always seek the views of SNH and Oscar. But if, looking at the bill as it is, does it have a resource implication for Visit Scotland? And if so, how do you intend to address that?
As far as I can see, the answer to that is no. Certainly in relation to quality assurance, the scheme is voluntary, and therefore we adjust the resource depending on the engagement with businesses. People pay to be assessed, and the resources are allocated accordingly. And we have over 30 years' experience of running the scheme now, so we're pretty well in the line there. In relation to the National Tourism Development Plan, I think it's quite an interesting question, because a number of people have said, well, fine, you produce the plan, but how are you going to implement it? And I think that the way that we see that working is I have in my team a series of regional directors who already engage predominantly with local authorities, but with local stakeholders. And there are a number of mechanisms for us to bring the plan to life. Whether it's through an area tourism partnership, and there are a number of very good ones in Scotland, whether it's through the existing arrangements on community planning, or whether it's just a local forum that would engage and bring those to life. And our role, I think, would be very much in relation to facilitation rather than actually doing it, making sure that the right people are around the table to turn the fine words in the plan into action on the ground. So to answer your question, as I see it right now, there are no immediate resource implications in the two areas I'm responsible for.
But obviously, even as a facilitator, that does require resourcing in itself, and you're quite content that the regulations aren't going to, it doesn't impose additional resources for you to
no, and indeed in relation to the plan, I think it gives my team a much more focused reason for engaging with local authorities. At the moment, our relationship is around the MOAs that we have in relation to funding for marketing activity. However, I think the National Tourism Development Framework and the relationship with planning will have a much greater impact on local economic delivery and local economic impact than the straightforward relationship we have at the moment. So I think it gives my existing staff a much better role in that at local level that we don't have at the moment. But I don't see any additional burden on our current resources.
And that includes no additional economic impact on yourselves?
No, not at all.
Excellent. Perhaps SNH?
Yes, thank you. Insofar as we can tell at this stage, where there's maybe details still to emerge, and the likes of the code, we don't know quite how that will work. But insofar as we can tell at the moment, I don't think we see this having any material implications for our resources. There are areas where we may do a bit more, but much of that we're doing already in one shape or form, so I think it kind of only complements or displaces that through our work within various Team Scotland, planning reform, fora, etc. The one area, another area of slight uncertainty is in relation to any reporting requirement on the new economic duty. We already have a duty to report on sustainable development under the Public Services Reform Act. At the edges, that could, if there's a separate reporting requirement, that could create a little bit of added complexity, but we're talking about the edges, I think, rather than anything substantive.
So you're fairly content then that it's not going to have any adverse impact within your current operations? Does it actually help you focus?
It may do, and it may help. There may be a number of areas here which will help with the way we're travelling, some of the issues around the guidance we give and the consistency, the understanding of that, all of which may help reduce our us manage within our resources and may then help offset the sorts of pressures we just wanted to put a little marker down against that Margaret McDougall raised.
Thank you. Perhaps Oscar?
I think likewise, I don't think we would see any great resource impact or implications for us. It's not too far out of line with where we are at the moment.
I'm sure we're all very probably maybe content and happy that it's not going to have any adverse effect on any of your organisations in that respect, resource-wise. Thank you for that, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you. Now, I think we ought to move on and look at the question of the economic duty that's going to be brought in, and the impact that will have, and maybe start off with Chick Rooney.
Yeah, I wonder, good morning. If you can explain to us what you think we mean by sustainable economic growth.
We have a pretty clear view in terms of sustainable economic growth, and we use the analogy of the three-legged stool, that sustainability on its own in terms of economic sustainability just doesn't work, and it has to have the social element and the environmental element working together.
And where do you place the emphasis on these three particularly?
They have to all be in balance, and one affects the other, because I think if you, from a tourism point of view, if you encourage far too many visitors to an area, and therefore you get great economic benefit, but it destroys the environment, then it is no good. And if the community doesn't accept the additional impact from visitors, then that's no good either, and it has to be in balance. And I've got to say there are very few areas in Scotland where I think...
And what do you do when there's conflict between any one of the three or any two of the three? Where does your priority lie?
I mean, at the end of the day, the economic benefit is important to the economy of Scotland. However, if that takes precedence over the others, then there's a chance that it won't be sustainable in the long term. And sustainability is about the long term.
That was my question. My question is, as far as you're concerned, of the three, if they're in conflict, which one do you believe your organisation comes down on? I understand the desire to have balance, but life isn't perfect. So, where is the priority?
At the end of the day, we're an economic development agency, and we're responsible for generating revenue to the Scottish economy. But that's not at all costs. And I think it's really important that we do recognise the social and the environmental impact. The very reason why people come to Scotland on holiday is because they love the landscape and the countryside, and also they like to engage with local people. And so the social element and environmental element are really, really important, and we ignore those at our peril in terms of long-term growth of Scottish tourism.
Okay. Mr. Burke?
Thank you. I share a lot of what Riddle has just said, but we see sustainable economic growth in the context of the government's purpose to make Scotland a more successful country with opportunities for all to flourish. So that sets the context for it, and the National Performance Framework provides the, if you like, the balancing mechanism for all these different interests that need to be recognised if growth is to be sustainable. That will start.
Well, we understand. We discussed process this morning, and we're now talking about planning frameworks. I mean, some of us would like to see outcomes. And how do you meaningfully report on the performance, the economic duty performance that each of your bodies has?
Well, the reporting we do on the sustainable development duty highlights the areas where our work contributes particularly to economic development. There will be wider areas where it contributes less directly. So we highlight our work in the planning system.
How do you report?
How do we report? There is a separate annex in our annual report which is laid before Parliament.
From a Visit Scotland perspective, we report within our annual report as well, and it's very much in relation to the return on investment that our marketing activity generates both within the UK and internationally, and the added value that we bring from the other activities that we carry out. For instance, on the quality assurance side, you might think, what impact does that have? But in fact, it has a significant impact on businesses investing in the quality of the product and improving it. And so therefore, as a direct result of our involvement and engagement with partners, you can link the two together. But the main reporting is on return on investment from marketing activity.
And you know how much investment you're actually making, or the whole industry is actually making?
No, what we're measuring, to be really clear on that, we're measuring the impact of our investment as an organisation in the benefit to the Scottish economy. The wider involvement of individual businesses is something that we measure overall on an annual basis, but our direct involvement is measured through the ROI work we do.
I'll come back to that, if I may, in terms of what teeth you have or what teeth you don't have in terms of regulation. Mr. Tyson.
Yeah. Likewise, we report annually. We have a report under the Public Service Reform Act, Service Scotland Reform Act. We have a duty to report on sustainable economic growth. Partly that's what we've done as a public body in terms of our activities, and partly it's what we've done as a regulator. I think, like Roger, our activity, some of it will have a sort of bearing on sustainable economic growth. A lot of what a lot of charities do doesn't have that sort of direct relationship. So it's.
I wonder, just on that, as I'm convener of the cross-party group on social enterprises, your name has never come up,
right?
Yeah, and there'd be in terms of helping guidelines. So, do you have a database of all the social enterprises, KICs, or third sector charity organisations?
We KICs can't be charities. Right. So we have a register of charities. That's one of our sort of main functions, and within that we will have the problem there quite often is social enterprise is a sort of label rather than the form, and you'll have a lot of different kinds of charities. They'll call themselves development trusts, community bodies, which will have a social enterprise element to them. So there's a sort of difficulty in actually sort of pinning down what's a social enterprise and what's not.
But you're the charity regulator. Many of these are charities.
Yes, indeed.
My view is we don't know how many there are out there. So how can you be regulating them?
We know how many charities there are. We're a charity regulator. We're not a social enterprise regulator. A lot of charities will have a social enterprise element. They will have a part of what they do, which is a social enterprise, which will be fundraising for the directly charitable activity. So they wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as social enterprises. It's not necessarily a very sort of definite or hard-edged label or a very hard-edged concept.
Should it be under new regulation?
Should social enterprises, social enterprises, be regulated? I think that would be quite difficult to do, because I think for the very reason it's hard to sort of pin down what they are. There are some bodies that would very definitely describe themselves as social enterprises. Some would say we're a charity, but we do a bit of social enterprise.
And are treated as charities.
Well, they're treated as charities because they're on the register, and they are therefore subject to charity regulation.
There are some that are not on a register. I'm just wondering
that's exactly right, yeah. And one of the things that's been done at the moment by Scottish Council for Voluntary Organisations is a database of the sort of larger voluntary sector. That includes the sort of non-charities. Also includes that'll include some social enterprises as well.
But you accept there are organisations out there that are treated as charities. You're the charity regulator, but you don't know all of them.
Yeah, we know all the charities that are on our register.
I would disagree with you. I can't even get the arm. Anyway, let me go on.
Really relevant to
I think it is in terms of regulation. I think it is. If I might just come back to Visit Scotland, you talked about we're talking in terms of regulations, and tourism and planning might how well you work together. We had a comment earlier about South Ayrshire, which was not particularly relevant. Now, let me give you one that is relevant. Why is it that we cannot get tourist signs, and I know you've responsibility for signposting, there is no regulation that allows planning authorities or indeed Visit Scotland to ensure that one of the fundamentals of achieving your objectives is not available, i.e. we cannot get brown signs, for example.
Just to be really clear on
It's
this.
left to the construction company or road company.
I'm not sure this is entirely relevant to the regulatory reform bill.
Well, I'm coming to the final point in a minute.
Just
Mr. Graham, perhaps you could try and answer the question.
just to be really clear on brown signposting. Visit Scotland's role is very simple. It is to communicate how people can apply for brown signs and to acknowledge whether or not they are in a quality assurance scheme. The responsibility for erecting the signs, manufacturing the signs and approving the signs sits either with the local authority or the Trunk Roads Authority. So just to be absolutely clear, as I speak right now, there is a seminar in another place involving the Tourism Minister on brown and white signposting, involving all local authorities and a significant number of industry people looking to try and improve the situation. Our role is only to acknowledge whether or not people are quality assured. If signs are turned down for whatever reason, then that responsibility lies with the local authority or the Trunk Roads Authority.
Right, just last question. As far as SNH is concerned, it was interesting that yesterday the Petitions Committee we had the old subject of wild land and the conflict. Tell me, on the basis that you will have significant input, and are mentioned in the schedules, to the regulatory reform bill, what happens when you put forward recommendations, or what's your view regarding the potential conflict from ministers determining from your recommendation of national standards and the applications to exceptions to them? How do you feel? Do you feel that you have teeth, that you're a doer, or you're just there to think?
Hope I'm interpreting those rules correctly. We provide, and there'll be a range of circumstances, so I can't possibly cover the whole range of situations where we might be providing advice. But when we provide advice, in relation to, obviously it will have different status, whether it's international designations or whether it's some nationally recognised important feature. In relation to wild land, we're in that territory, not in terms of international. So our advice is just that. Ultimately, in planning terms, we are not the decision taker. Others are required to balance the range of interest in their decision. Where they reach that decision, we don't then take a view on how we feel about that decision. That is their decision.
Do you measure how many of your recommendations to ministers on regulation or changes are successful?
To ministers, I think we could probably provide that answer. To local authorities, I'm not certain whether we could quickly extract that from our systems. They probably we've been updating them over the years to meet changing needs. I'm not certain whether they could I could give you that answer.
Mr. Graham?
To wild land? Or
No. In relation to recommendations that you make to ministers, and what happens if a potential conflict arises from ministers determining either from your advice or your recommendation as to what national standard should be, and then if there are applications to circumvent these or to be accepted from them. I mean, again, the question is, how many of your recommendations are accepted and how many are rejected?
Again, it will vary in relation to the advice that we've been asked. We provide advice on a range of issues affecting tourism. In most cases, they're taken account of, but ultimately we have to recognise that there's a democratic system in place that may overrule them. But we could certainly find that information for you if you require it.
So to all three, how much do you think you will influence the regulation reform bill? With the emphasis on influence.
I suppose I would look at it the other way around, and I would look at the way that the bill has influenced us as an organisation. We've never really been directly involved in the planning system, and one of the reasons that the Tourism Development Plan and framework has been developed was on the back of the work that Russell Griggs led in developing the whole bill. As you know, he's a board member of Visit Scotland, yep. And as he sought advice from colleagues around the table on the Visit Scotland board, one of the issues that they raised as a key issue to be looked at and a more consistent approach taken was planning. And so as an organisation, we've not really been involved historically in that, and now we are directly involved in pulling that plan together and encouraging a more consistent approach, but also a greater focus on local economic development through tourism, through the planning system. That wouldn't have happened had the bill not been going through this process.
Okay.
I was going to come in and say, open with very similar thing. I think we're thinking about this much more in terms of how the bill impacts on us rather than how we can influence the bill or how far we have done. We responded to the consultations. Really, again, in terms of relatively minor points of detail, we see that working its way through. We think we can contribute to some of the codes and that sort of thing that will follow from this bill, but not the bill itself. And in terms of its impact on us, we see it actually reinforcing the direction we're travelling.
Likewise, I think we'd see it in terms of the influence on us, and as I've said in the written submission, we're very keen to be involved in the preparation of the codes of practice and how it works in the nitty-gritty of what we do.
Thank you.
Still on economic duty, I think, Alison Johnson.
Yes, and I'd like to direct my questions to Roger Burton, if I may, convener. Scottish Natural Heritage already has a statutory balancing duty. Has that helped in your core purpose of protecting Scotland's natural heritage?
I believe firmly that it has. We've perhaps in recent years given greater weight to it, and I think that we see considerable benefits from the way we have begun to embrace that, and that in essence the natural heritage, the quality of our landscapes and our nature is at the core of sustainable development. It's a huge asset to the country. And the need to look after it is recognised. And that contributes to this sustainable economic growth.
And do you see it as the role of Scottish Natural Heritage to balance environmental and economic priorities?
In some situations, again, we're not the decision taker in every situation, but in terms of our policies, then I think it's really important that we do so. And in certain where we are the decision taker, again, we need to do that. Again, I come back to the fact that by balancing, actually, I believe we secure more effectively the conservation and enhancement of the natural heritage because that is recognised.
The proposal for an economic duty, do you see that in any way as duplication of what you're already doing or double counting?
It could be seen as that. If it is, then the provisions of, I think it's subsection 4, probably mean that the new duty may not apply, but if it did apply, then we see it as just reinforcing and adding to our existing duties.
But you don't see this duty as impacting on your ability to give, independent advice on any conflict?
No, because again, I think the bill is clear that there are situations where it should not override the primary purpose or duties on a public body.
Okay. Finally, are you clear that there is an understanding of what sustainable economic growth means? And not just with Scottish Natural Heritage?
In the wider world, I'm quite sure there are a range of views on what sustainable economic growth means. I think I've already answered how we see it in terms of the government's purpose, but I acknowledge that there is a much more esoteric debate going on, and maybe a practical debate too, but one that I don't want to go into here.
Would you prefer if sustainable development was used instead?
I don't think we have a strong view. As I say, that there is this point of lack of clarity or potential overlap with the existing duty we have to report on sustainable development. and if we were to have a duty to report on sustainable economic growth, I'm not entirely clear in my mind how we would tease those apart at this point in time.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe I could just ask a follow-up to Alison Johnson's question. So just in some way, sort of slightly rephrasing what I think Alison Johnson was trying to get at. Maybe I could ask this to all three of you. What difference will this economic duty make to the way that you currently operate and deliver services, if any? Mr. Burton.
I don't think it will make any difference because we already work towards the National Performance Framework, and it sits within that context. That's high up on the tree of the pyramid that the framework builds.
Okay.
In a very similar way, I think our answer would be almost mirroring that. However, I think what's encouraging from the consultation exercise that's just come out on the National Planning Framework, for the first time ever, sustainable economic development appears. And I think that's a really positive step, and I think we need to take some credit for influencing that. And I think it's quite interesting, in speaking to local authorities, in nearly every instance they will tell you that tourism is a really important part of the local economy, and yet when you delve below the level of plans to see whether or not tourism and therefore economic development come together, quite often they're missing. And so the whole thinking behind the National Tourism Development Framework is to make sure that tourism is seen as a key sector within the local economy and that it is key to sustainable economic growth. And that's not necessarily been the case in the past. And I'm delighted to see in the plan that we've developed that we've now got all local authorities signing up to that approach. So I think there has been an influence in recognising that.
I think that there are areas of the work that we do and areas of charity that it won't make much difference to. I think that probably the area where it will have a focus is in what Mr. Brodie was talking about, and that is the sort of regeneration, development, social enterprise type charities, and where I think that it'll feed into the work that we're already doing with some of the umbrella bodies there in trying to facilitate work with those charities.
Thank you. Right, unless there are other members who haven't yet caught my eye who want to come in and ask questions, I think that's probably the end of our session. So can I thank you all very much for your contribution. It's been very helpful to the committee, and we'll have a short suspension as we move into private session, I think, so we'll suspend briefly.